Welcome all. My name is John Bird, and I'm representing the Strategic Studies Department here at Joint Special Operations University. Today we are pleased to present a distinguished speaker, including audience Q&A. This session is unclassified and will be recorded and posted to the JSOW network. Please keep in mind that the views and the opinions expressed by all participants do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or policies of the U.S. government, Department of Defense, or U.S. SOCOM.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Mark Rainey, and we are broadcasting from the Joint Special Operations University located in sunny Tampa, Florida, aboard MacDill Air Force Base. I want to welcome everyone to another Think JSOW webinar. Think JSOW is an ongoing webinar series that explores the research and publications of JSOW's faculty, leading defense-oriented academics, and the U.S. and international special operations community members. These interviews and conversations are intended for educational purposes to supplement existing publications, articles, and other active discussions throughout the DoD. You can find the collection and other JSOW content on YouTube. As such, we encourage everyone to subscribe to our JSOW's YouTube channel. I think this week we started sharing the recent Indo-PACOM forum material. Lastly, don't forget to visit and follow us on Facebook and LinkedIn. If you have joined us before, the summer series format is going to be just a little different. We are, of course, going to start with a few warm-up questions between myself and the author. But instead of waiting till the end, we would like to engage you, the audience, early and often. A little bit about the author. Dr. Koven serves as a training director at the near-peer competition, lead researcher and counterterrorism lead researcher at the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism, or START, at the University of Maryland. He is a senior fellow at West Point's Modern War Institute and the adjunct faculty here at the Joint Special Operations University. He has published more than 50 works. Dr. Koven is a tried and true alum of the George Washington University, home of Georgia's Army. When I say he is alum, I mean he truly bleeds in the buff and blue colors. Barnett earned a bachelor's, a master's of arts, a master's of philosophy, and a PhD in Washington, D.C.'s Foggy Bottom. Welcome to the webinar, Dr. Koven. How are you today?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. How about yourself?
Doing well, doing well. Well, so in moving right into the article and your thoughts, today's policy rhetoric and your article asserts strategic competition is or has firmly replaced terrorism in primacy in the U.S. national security characteristic and the U.S. forces. As such, their platforms, equipment, and training, and of course, operations must meet these new challenges in the globally compounded security environment. I've read several articles this last week that stated that competition is not a contest of brute force, and the future of the U.S. defense strategy must do much more than deter war, and that policymakers using historical precedents as a catalog for peer competition success is fraught with risk. So thinking along those lines with those authors, how do you see, and more specifically, where does the article align with each of these authored assertions?
Yeah, so generally speaking, I couldn't agree more with these assertions. In terms of competition today not being a contest of brute force, I think that's borne out by and large in sort of the actions that we have seen near-peer competitors take in recent years. It's not to say that there isn't still space for the use of kinetic military force, but if you look at sort of Russian behavior, for example, even in their near abroad, where they have engaged in sort of kinetic activity in places like Georgia or Eastern Ukraine, the bulk of their activities have been non-kinetic in nature. Right, so I spent some time actually studying this for Special Operations Command, and we were able to catalog that approximately 4/5 of all Russian actions in Eastern Ukraine were non-kinetic in nature. and fell along sort of the diplomatic, informational, economic, legal, etc. Instruments of national power as opposed to the military instrument. But in other areas, what we've seen is that Russia has decided to embrace the use of influence operations through cyberspace and has often been able to achieve their strategic ends short of using kinetic force through doing so. If you look at China, for example, it's very clear to me that they have prioritized sort of economic expansionism and political and economic sort of instruments to provide them with leverage in, say, the more than 60 countries that now form the Belt and Road Initiative, and even more broadly than that. And I think the Chinese experience is perhaps in part a reaction to watching the US fight two very costly wars, small wars in Iraq and Syria, and not wanting to do the same. In terms of the US government needing to do more than deter, which I think was the second prong of that question, that's absolutely correct. Peer and near-peer competitors like China and Russia do not embrace the sort of war-peace duality or this binary that the US government has, right? There's a continuum of competition that ends in a sort of a declared shooting war, but the competition is occurring below the threshold of war all the time. For the US, by sort of embracing this war-peace duality, we envision ourselves as winning if we've deterred that shooting war. Whereas in fact, what we're doing is playing directly into the hands of our near-peer competitors like Russia and China, who do not want a declared shooting war with the United States, at least not at this moment, but nevertheless are able to achieve sort of strategically desirable objectives short of that conflict. And we're not paying close enough attention as a result to what's going on below the threshold of war. And finally, in terms of historical precedent, I think that's absolutely sort of some rich history that we can draw upon here. The Cold War was a competition between sort of the Soviet Union and the United States, or more broadly, NATO and the Warsaw Pact countries. And that never devolved into a declared shooting war, at least not directly between the two superpowers. Nevertheless, the US was able to compete and, in my opinion, win in that combination below the threshold of open armed conflict. And I think there are lessons that I'm sure we'll discuss shortly that we can draw upon again for this 21st century competition.
That's a great opening. I really appreciate that, because those articles are just straight in line with yours. And you know, your article is just so timely and relevant to what we're doing. And with the interim security strategy out that has language in it, as you indicated, but also as they contemplate what this new national security strategy is going to look like and how this administration is going to address those challenges. This article gives them, I believe, that option to look at unconventional warfare as a possibility. So jumping on to the next question is, in your article, you briefly discussed the idea of net assessment. I don't think that a lot of people are familiar with the idea of net assessment, but it is a central theme for your article and how and why the unconventional warfare aspect is so important. Would you mind describing the audience what is meant by net assessment and how has it been applied historically?
Absolutely. So net assessment really entails taking a holistic view of both blue, the US government and its capabilities, but also red, the enemy or adversary, as well as potentially green, sort of those partner nations and others that are caught in the middle, and sort of looking at this all as a complete picture, right? You do not get a war or competition short of war without at least two sides, and often many more than that. But I think importantly, net assessment pushes beyond sort of things that are easily quantified. And so I remember reading a lot of sort of the Cold War era modeling and simulations work that was done that hinged entirely on how quickly Warsaw Pact armored forces would mobilize and what was the equivalent value of, say, a T-72 tank to an American M1A1 at the time. And those are important characteristics, don't get me wrong, but it leaves a lot to be desired. There's a lot of sort of human performance factors, sort of cultural considerations and whatnot that affect force employment and even before that affect sort of decisions about how to escalate and whether or not to go to war or to compete in a different means. And those are too often left out of sort of the traditional military modeling and simulation work that gets done. Andy Marshall really pioneered the art of net assessment and competitive strategy for the Pentagon, beginning in the 1950s up until quite recently. He was literally forced to retire in his early 90s, but I think otherwise would have stayed on the job until his unfortunate passing. But I think the really interesting thing about net assessment is it can help the US government figure out a better and more efficient way to compete at lower cost and lower risk. And let me give you just one really quick Cold War era example of this. There was an early debate about whether or not the US government should invest heavily in strategic bomber forces or intercontinental ballistic missiles as sort of the premier nuclear weapons delivery vehicle. And the Air Force argument and sort of the technical argument was, let's go heavily on the intercontinental ballistic missiles. They are cheaper, they are more accurate, and they're harder to defeat. That sounds like a slam dunk. However, what Andy Marshall sort of observed was, hey, if you do this, the Soviet Union is likely going to invest in the same technology, and it's a technology that we have no real way of defending against. If, however, you invest in strategic bombers, you can play into sort of Soviet fears about violation of their territory, which go back thousands of years in Russian history. Russia's been invaded at least 12 times, if you're willing to go back a millennia. But also into sort of specific fears about violations of their airspace from their experience with the Luftwaffe during the Second World War. And if you do this, you'll convince the Russians to invest in integrated air defense systems, a weapon system that is purely defensive in nature, i.e. cannot be used to threaten the US, and a weapon system that's going to cost 10 times more than the strategic bomber fleet that the US would build in order to encourage the Russians to do the same. That's a victory because you're forcing the Russians to spend considerably more while denying them the ability with that defense spending to threaten us. And so that's sort of the essence of competitive strategy, what net assessment enables, right? Imposition of asymmetric cost, whether that's on the battlefield or in sort of military and defense budgets.
Okay. That is a very good answer. And I think Mr. Murray was probably at net assessment as long as you were at George Washington. So I just want to jump in here. I actually got a question from William Janis, from an adjunct professor at Fordham Law School. And I just want to pose it to you. And he's talking, oh, never mind. Hold on. Are there limitations to containing great powers through financial statecraft sanctions, AML regulation, when many of our NATO allies are centers for illicit finance and that are recipients, for example, of offshore Russian and Chinese money? I don't think that we're actually talking about financial statecraft at this point, but does that go into the calculations of the net assessment? And is there something you could address to that question?
Yeah, I'm happy to take a stab at it. I do want to preface this that I know very little about sort of counter-threat finance and anti-money laundering. I often get questions about it, but I am by no means an expert. With that said, I'll try and pontificate a little bit, and maybe I'll address this at sort of a higher level of abstraction. The sort of one thing that really, I think, helped the US government succeed during the Cold War was our allies and partners and the strong relationships we had with them, and the fact that they saw the competition, or at least some of them saw the competition with the Soviet Union as an existential threat, not only to American survival, but to their own. That was certainly the case with our sort of NATO allies on the European continent. I'm not sure our allies and partners view the current epic of competition with Russia and China, and to a lesser extent, Iran and North Korea, in the same way. And as a result, we would have to factor in to any type of net assessment we were going to do today, sort of the extent to which we can expect our allies to stand with us, both in sort of rhetoric, but also in terms of inaction. And I think that's going to be much more difficult when it comes to sort of countering threat finance and countering some of the financial activities that may benefit these competitors. And indeed, we saw precisely this with a sort of lesser willingness of our European allies and partners to condemn Russian actions in Ukraine, and admittedly for good reason. If I were the German government, I would be afraid of what happens if the oil and gas gets cut off to my countrymen during wintertime in Germany.
Okay. Well, I hope that, obviously I don't have a direct line to William, but I hope that he can kind of respond there in the chat box and let me know if that kind of got it to what he was looking for. And certainly in our context right now is focusing kind of on the net assessment of how we evaluate that our peer competitors and how we've used it in history. So jumping right into a more controversial issue, because net assessment has proven its value and worth, and certainly your article details that out. The DoD defines unconventional warfare as activities conducted to enable a resistance movement or an insurgency to coerce, disrupt, or overthrow a government occupying power by operating through or with an underground auxiliary and guerrilla force in a denied area. And for the audience, I'm gonna actually paste and copy that definition down into the chat box, because I know you didn't catch all that. But my question is you provide, or my thoughts is you provide several examples in the article, but for those that haven't read the article yet, and for those that might be unfamiliar with the DoD's definition and use of unconventional warfare, can you describe or can you provide some historical examples where it's been used, what we've done with it, and kind of just the general scope of what it is?
Absolutely. Let me give you three, one historical and two quite a bit more recent. The historical one is perhaps sort of my favorite example, and it is the case of Operation Cyclone. And Operation Cyclone was a CIA-led activity, and of course this is all unclassified and fully releasable now, to support the Mujahideen, these freedom fighters who were fighting against the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan-led government, which was of course backed by the Soviet Union, and then subsequently fighting against the Soviet Union, who invaded to support a rather weak PDPA communist government in Afghanistan. And so the US covertly, with support from Pakistan and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, amongst others, covertly provided training and assistance to the Mujahideen, including famously the provision of man-portable air defense systems, which were used to devastating effect against Soviet Hind attack helicopters. But the US support to the Mujahideen contributed to 14,500 Soviet personnel killed in action, another 35,000 Soviet casualties, and arguably accelerated sort of the bankruptcy of the Soviet state. It turns out Afghanistan was very expensive for the Soviets to operate in, just as it would be for the US government decades later, right? I would argue that in sort of the immediate term, this was a huge success. It cost the US literally fractions of a penny on the dollar to do this relative to the cost it imposed in the Soviet Union, and it helped accelerate the demise of the number one threat to sort of the American way of life and American national security at the time, the Soviet Union. That is a reductionist answer, and there were some long-term sort of negative externalities there, and I'll come back to those when we discuss risk a little bit later, right? I don't want to, but I do want to just caveat that this wasn't all rosy. Okay.
Yeah, and I think that's a great response, and I think so. One thing that I kind of failed to kind of mention as we were going through this was the operational information environment. And one of the questions that we got was, and if you could kind of tie in the OIE with the UW piece in response to this question, it might be helpful for carrying our dialogue further. Russia, prior to the invasion of parts of Ukraine and deployment in Syria, there has been an employment of US and UK journalists in malign activities on mainstream media, feeding fake stories and reports. How should news corporations counter these influences?
That's a brilliant question. And I think sort of influence and more specifically operations in the information environment are a key facet to the competition we're currently locked in, right? We've seen Russia in particular use OIE with devastating effect against sort of their near abroad, against some of our NATO allies, like the Baltic countries, against the US and the US population, including narratives that explicitly target US military personnel, and against sort of our near abroad as well. We've seen an extensive use of Russian OIE in places like Colombia and Mexico, which stand out because they are major US government security partners right here in the Western Hemisphere. And certainly we've seen these narratives in US media and US news as well. And I don't know that there is an easy solution to this, right? I think over the long term, the solution is sort of what I call inoculation. And that means teaching our publics in Western democracies to be more informed consumers of media, whether they're reading the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, or getting their news via Twitter or Facebook or Instagram or what have you. Over the short term, though, I think there is a real need to get a better handle on sort of the propagation of disinformation over especially sort of new media like social media, and to do whatever we can through sort of technical means to counter this. I think there's also potentially opportunities for the US government to use this to their advantage, but that requires, I think, better interagency coordination than is already occurring on the USG side of the House. I know we have the Global Engagement Center at the State Department that is supposed to be doing precisely this, but there's definitely more room to grow here. I think one thing to do, though, is sort of reinstill old school journalistic values and ethics, right? We need to be responsible presenters of media as well, and we need to carefully evaluate our sources. And this is not meant as a partisan critique. It stands on both sides of the aisle here. So hopefully that answered the question, but I will give a shameless plug for anyone who's interested in operations in the information environment in particular. Myself and Captain Dr. Margaret Smith of the Army Cyber Institute at West Point are co-curating a series on OIE for great power competition with the Modern War Institute at West Point, and a new article in that series goes live every Monday morning, and we can throw up the link for that in the chat box.
Okay. So the next thing I'm going to ask you to do is, how does UW fit into the interim national security strategy and strategic competition? But before I move on to that, I got one net assessment question that I want to kind of re-engage with real quick here by James. Based on your description of net assessment, how do you view risk of the U.S. being drawn into an unfavorable arms race with China and Russia? And I think that really ties into, how does your article on UW fit in the INS as well as strategic competition?
That's an excellent question. Thank you, James. And so one example I give in the article, which I think is worth reiterating here, clearly illustrates to me that we've already been drawn into an arms race on unfavorable terms to the United States. And what I mean by this specifically is, look at naval competition right now. And if you look at the current US shipbuilding plan, we are investing massively in building capital ships and building out a very expensive Navy. And now this, as a gut reaction, makes some sense. The People's Liberation Army Navy, the Chinese Navy, has already surpassed the US if you measure by number of ships. We're still winning if you measure by tonnage in terms of naval forces. The problem, though, is China, for its aims, to achieve its aims, needs a green water Navy that can operate in China's near abroad, full stop. If the US wants to engage in a conventional naval arms race with China, it requires two separate, more expensive blue water navies. We need the current carrier strike group heavy Navy that we currently employ around the rest of the world to be employed in much the same way as it's already being used. Plus, we need a largely separate blue water Navy to operate inside of China's A2AD, their anti-access area denial bubble, And this Navy has to be systematically cheaper, right? Carrier strike groups are not going to be survivable inside of China's A2AD bubble. So by locking us into this conventional naval competition, they've forced us to build two very expensive navies to counter their one relatively cheap navy. If we keep doing that, we're going to spend ourselves into a loss here. You don't actually need that shooting war. We'll bankrupt ourselves, especially given sort of the relative sizes of the two economies. Unconventional warfare, I think, offers an opportunity to flip this and impose asymmetric cost on our near-peer competitors, force them to spend 10 times as much for every dollar we put into the fight. But unfortunately, I don't think we should be thinking about competing conventionally with China or Russia as sort of a pathway to victory here.
So real quick, I mean, I'm going to do a little reflection on a forum we attended last couple of weeks, and in it we talked about China's maritime forces is more of a fishing fleet today with irregular kind of maritime uses. So how does something like that, where they're already starting to not build up in militarily, counter the kind of thought process that we need to build up militarily when they're not actually doing that?
I mean, I think part of the problem, and this is, I know there was a disclaimer on the first slide that these are not official US government opinions, but I will reiterate that once more. I think part of the problem here is it's not just about we're seeing what China's doing and we're reacting. We're also fighting with what, in my very much my personal opinion, is the most important war that the Department of Defense fights on a regular basis, and that's the inter-service budget war, right? The Navy, by sort of advocating a strategy that involves sort of a large capital shipbuilding plan, is able to capture more of the budget pie and thus win against, say, the Army or the Air Force in this sort of internal budget war that DoD fights on a repeated basis. And so I think, unfortunately, our sort of acquisitions programs are not solely informed by what competitors are doing, but also by internal processes. So with that said, I'm not sure looking at what China is doing provides the whole answer or the whole explanation for what the US government is currently doing. And again, that's very much my personal opinion, and I realize that's inflammatory to some. That said, I think we've also sort of really focused in not so much on these sort of gray zone type fleets that China is building up, like this sort of fishing fleet and things of that sort, but more on sort of their the military capacity that they are building, and capacity that's specifically designed to counter certain US capabilities, right? So we've seen a ton of very small Chinese naval vessels that are just loaded with anti-ship missiles designed to kill American carrier strike groups. And I think sort of that was sort of an alarm bell to many in the US Navy that, okay, wait, we need to think on how we're going to survive something like this and what types of ships we do need to be building now, in addition to preserving the sort of traditional US Navy, if you will. So I think that's more what senior leaders may have been focusing on relative to the sort of gray fleet, if you will, that you mentioned.
Okay. Yeah, I would love to continue down the idea of comparing apples to apples, their government systems to our military systems and their commercial systems compared to our commercial systems, because they obviously have an advantage with regards to them being integrated compared to the way in which we separate out our commercial and our military systems. So, but I'm going to move on. I'm not going to stay there. Really, in the article, I want to get into something a little more controversial, and I would like to get into the article where you made an argument for redefining unconventional warfare, stipulating that strategic competition is the primary emphasis given, is too far-reaching, may not be necessary, possible, or overly complicated. However, in the article, you stop short of proposing a new definition. If you would describe for us your thoughts on, one, why you decided not to offer a propose a new definition, and two, why you believe Given unconventional warfare's current definition, overthrow may not be necessary or advisable. Long-term indigenous forces may not be possible in peer competition scenarios.
Yeah, absolutely. So I decided to sort of take this middle ground and give you a list of 4 things that I think are wrong with the current definition or in need of revision for the 21st century, but stop short of giving you a fully revised new definition. And I stopped short of providing sort of my view of what a new definition would look like for 2 reasons. The first being that would sort of take away, I think that would require all the space that was allotted to me for this article and take away from the argument that this is needed in the first place. And I think sort of convincing senior leaders that redefining UW is necessarily a priori to coming up with precisely what that definition looks like. And then secondly, there's a debate currently going on APAN about sort of redefining unconventional warfare. And there's a lot of great content there. And I know a number of sort of scholars are currently looking at precisely this issue. And so 2 of my good friends, Colonel retired Otto Fiala and Lieutenant Colonel retired Jim Worrell, have a piece in the work that looks exclusively at a new definition of UW. And I've seen some drafts of that. So I figured, okay, let me focus on why this is necessary and set the stage. And let me let the others, including Jim and Otto, but also a whole slew of other scholars who are already working on this, continue to sort of set up exactly what that definition should look like. And I reserve the right to weigh in later through perhaps another article, but sort of that was the thought process here. In terms of what I think is wrong with the current definition, sort of the second part of your question, that unconventional warfare has overwhelmingly focused on the overthrow of governments or occupying powers, at least historically. And admittedly, in the definition from the DoD offers that you pasted in the chat, coercion and disruption are also mentioned. But if you look at sort of how this has been operationalized in practice with the special operations sort of resistance pyramid, as well as sort of past episodes of UW, the focus has overwhelmingly been on that overthrow bit. And I think the overthrow bit is wrong for 2 reasons. One, if you think about, I think a lot of people are still thinking about sort of direct competition with China or Russia. And I absolutely do not think overthrowing the Chinese Communist Party is a good idea here. If Afghanistan and Iraq look painful in terms of the reconstruction bills that were handed to the American taxpayer, I can't even fathom what the cost would be of sort of reintegrating 900 million starving peasants into an agrarian economy that can at best support 100 million of them. But again, my argument here is not to use UW against sort of Russia and China in their homelands, but rather that this offers opportunities in sort of their near abroad and in areas where they're trying to exert influence. But even there, I don't think the goal should be to remove China from, say, Pakistan or other countries along the Belt and Road. I think a lot more damage can be done through a slow bleed. And I think this is exactly what the US government has experienced in Afghanistan, for example, which Russia and Iran and others did use sort of as a lever to impose sort of long-running cost on the US government, right? So Iran routinely ratcheted up support to the Taliban when it suited their interest in terms of forcing the US to the negotiating table or things of that around the JCPOA and other sort of benchmark moments. But more importantly than just sort of using this as a lever, going back to the operations in the information environment bit, if you can get a ragtag force of, say, a local force in Baluchistan to pin down the Chinese army, that is a victory in the information environment. And the longer that goes on, the better, because no one expects these folks to win. But the more headlines you can get in the international press, the more this shows that, hey, China's weaker than we thought, and maybe those who are suffering sort of Chinese economic occupation somewhere else might be more encouraged to resist them organically, even absent US support. So I think a lot can be gained by thinking more on sort of the coercion and disruption and less on the overthrow bit. The other sort of critiques of this had to do with operating in a denied area. And if you look at sort of the ISR, the intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities of both China and Russia, including those which they've exported to their partners. So if you look at sort of Chinese sort of safe cities initiative with really advanced sort of surveillance capabilities for governments throughout Africa and elsewhere, the ability to operate a clandestine resistance movement over extended periods of time on the ground in these places is likely not that great. So whereas unconventional warfare is traditionally focused on sort of a guerrilla force as well as a clandestine force in the form of an underground that was supporting them, I'm not sure that sort of under the purely clandestine forces are going to be possible over the long run, at least in these denied areas. So I think we need to be thinking more about covert, deniable, but still detectable guerrilla forces, less so than, say, the underground portion of the movement that is sort of specified in classical unconventional warfare. That said, the physics that used to govern warfare no longer apply to nearly the same extent today, right? John Mearsheimer in the 20th century wrote pretty famously about the incredible stopping power of water. That may be true for conventional armed conflict, but an ocean does nothing to stop sort of cyber engagements. And those can happen instantaneously, irrespective of distance, physical distance. And so I do think there's an opportunity to provide support to these guerrilla forces operating covertly, but not clandestinely, from safe areas through sort of novel 21st century means. And I think that also needs to be accounted for in the definition. And then I think the fourth sort of piece of the definition that is important here is occupation, right? The, UW focuses on doing something, coercion, disruption, or overthrow of a government or occupying power. And admittedly, DoD does not define occupation, but I think we think of it, we sort of default to thinking of this as sort of a military occupation. So think the French resistance fighting against a Nazi German occupation, right? That's a classical example of UW. And as I sort of mentioned earlier, China has eschewed military aventurism, having watched sort of the US experience over the last 20 years. They're focused on sort of political and economic domination, but I would argue some of the abusive practices that they're engaging in, especially in the developing world, in terms of debt trap diplomacy, extractive resources with horrible environmental and labor implications, and so on and so forth, may be viewed as something tantamount to an occupation by the populations living in those areas. So I think we need to broaden the aperture of what we mean from military occupation to also include sort of political and economic occupation in any new definition of UW. I'm sorry that was a long answer, but I think it's really important to start to talk about how the definition needs to change and what it would take to get this right.
No, not at all. I think it's I think that's great. And I've lost my Q&A chat box down here, so I'm trying to relocate it. Oh, there we go. In a world of from William again, in a world of unconventional warfare and China and Russia's desire to avoid a shooting war, would a 21st century sphere of influence system be prudent, as it would force China, given its BRI and FDI footprint, to stabilize Afghanistan and Iran, for example? Does the US lose anything by this? And I will post this so you can read it a little bit more closely, because that's a lengthy question that probably needs your, there you go.
So I heard sort of sphere of influence system, and then I heard Afghanistan specifically. And so I think there's two parts to my answer. In general, I don't think the US can sort of cede to China and Russia their respective spheres of influence, right? This sends a very clear message that we are not reliable partners, because ceding Russia's historical sphere of influence back to Russia would mean abandoning our NATO allies, most certainly the Baltic countries and Poland, if not more than that. And I don't think that's tenable. And once you do that, that sets Russia up brilliantly for an OIE campaign of their own to all of our other partners that the US government is an unreliable partner. Your best bet is throwing in with us because they're going to abandon you. The same would be relevant in sort of Southeast Asia, in China's near abroad, right? What kind of message would this send to the Taiwanese, or even a little bit further afield to the Vietnamese and the Philippines? So I don't think we can go back to a sort of let's divide up the world in three sphere of influence type approach here. With respect to Afghanistan specifically, however, since I know that was mentioned in the chat, that's a unique case. And again, this is very, very, very clearly me speaking sort of from my personal opinion and not representative of anyone else, including the US government. But I think this sort of loss in Afghanistan is that's already written into the history books. The decision is very clear to withdraw from Afghanistan, remaining personnel, and the agreement with the Taliban is farcical, in my opinion.
Yeah, let me jump in and reiterate that the last half of that question, because it wasn't about the U.S. It was about China, given its BRI footprint to stabilize Afghanistan and Iran, for example. Is it in that is the sphere of influence important or prudent, given that they have to do that in order to continue their resourcing of minerals or rare earth metals and things like that in Afghanistan?
Yeah, so I am getting there, but
Sorry.
That's okay. No, I'm very verbose.
I just want to make sure it wasn't you were focused on the U.S. It was more of the BRI.
I think the damage to the sort of U.S. reputation and to the security environment to Afghanistan is already done, and that those sort of dice were cast a while back. Now that that's the case, and we've very clearly signaled that that the U.S. government is not going to remain with Afghanistan for the long haul, I think there's very little cost of adopting what I've called a "we broke it, you bought it" type approach to this. And I honestly don't think we broke it. I think Afghanistan was broken long before 2001. But regardless, Russia cares a lot about strategic depth in Central Asia. And both Russia and China care quite a bit about sort of economic opportunities and extractive industries in Central Asia, and also potentially in Afghanistan itself, right? China owns a huge amount of rights to rare earth minerals under the ground in Afghanistan. And China also shares a land border with Afghanistan in Badakhshan province. It's not a very easily passable land border, but it is a land border nonetheless. And you do have groups like the ETIM, the East Turkestan Islamic Movement, a group of Uyghur extremists who are fighting with the Taliban and with Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, but very clearly have grievances against the Chinese government. So given the geographic proximity and the vested sort of economic and security interests that both Russia and China have in the region, I'm not sure it's terrible from a US perspective that if we adopt sort of a "we broke it, you bought it" type standpoint and now force the Chinese and the Russians to invest at least a little bit more in stabilizing Afghanistan, or more likely at a minimum, investing a little bit more in at least ensuring that this conflict doesn't spill over into their borders or into their other partners in Central Asia.
Okay, thanks. That's a great response. Given to our previous question, you kind of talked about some of the obstacles and potential risk and what have you with regards to overthrow and long-term indigenous forces, things like that, and challenges there. So in this next question, and I'll post it down here real quick so you can read it as I'm reading it. Describe the utility and benefits to U.S. leadership employing an unconventional warfare approach in strategic competition and UW's risk implications.
Perfect, thank you. The benefits are that the cost imposition is asymmetric, right? $100,000 of support and a bit of training to some of these sort of extant groups that already have grievances against Russian and Chinese interest can impose tens of millions of dollars of cost on sort of Russia or China. And so in the article, and I do want to make clear that I also caveat in the article that I'm not actually recommending the US government provide support to the Baluchistan Liberation Army, which is a designated foreign terrorist organization. But in the article, I chose that example because it's controversial and it would get people talking and thinking. So let me rehash it here. This is a group that has already proved somewhat adept at attacking Chinese interest in Baluchistan, Pakistan, which, by the way, is the most important area on Belt and Road, at least in terms of extant Chinese investment. They've invested over 60 billion with a B US dollars in Baluchistan alone. There's a really soft underbelly here insofar as sort of Chinese approaches use Chinese labor and tons of Chinese personnel. If the BLA got a little bit better, as i.e. some of their attacks actually hit home and were more damaging, this would force the Chinese to commit security forces to defend their interest and this soft underbelly along Belt and Road, or to abandon it, which in and of itself is sort of a PR victory if you were thinking OIE again. And again, we're talking 6, maybe 7 figures worth of training and support to each of these various groups to impose costs that are an order of magnitude greater. So I think that's sort of the benefit here. The other benefit is potentially, if you do this in enough places, if you have 15 or 20 Baluchistans, you potentially pull enough Chinese forces off of strategic objectives that are perhaps more important to US national security interests, because they'll be faced with sort of the same problems we are. There's finite resources and they have to prioritize. The risks, I think, are twofold. One is a risk of escalation and of getting caught. In terms of the escalatory, and then the second risk is sort of long-term negative externalities. In terms of the escalatory risk, what happens if the Chinese government finds out that we're supporting the BLA and then they then go again and attack the Chinese consulate in Baluchistan, which they tried to do absent US support years ago, and they failed, but they got pretty close. Well, attacking a consulate of a foreign power is an act of war under the Geneva Convention. There may be some risk that this leads to a shooting war between sort of China and the US, and that's something we absolutely don't want. Fortunately, however, I think the risk is lower than we might assume. It's something that the Chinese don't want as well. And there's sort of precedent of these types of highly aggressive actions being uncovered and not leading to open armed confrontation. And I'll give you 2 examples of this. During the Vietnam conflict, Soviet and Chinese advisors helped operate SAM sites, surface-to-air missile sites, and shoot down US aircraft. The US government knew it. The US government knew that the Chinese and Russians were on the ground and in more than just sort of an advisory capacity. And that conflict never escalated into a shooting war directly between the US and China or between the US and Russia. Inversely, the US Air Force accidentally bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, Serbia in 1999 during the NATO air war over the former Yugoslavia. The Chinese did not and still do not believe that this was an accident. Nevertheless, the retaliation was limited to sort of diplomatic announcements and some protests that admittedly turned violent. There was some rock throwing outside of US embassies and consulates in mainland China. Now, that example is a bit reductionist. China has more levers with which to react today than they did in 1999, but I'm still reasonably confident that even if this was uncovered, the reaction would stop well short of a declared shooting war, given sort of the desire to avoid that, and also the desire for China to look to sort of be able to take the moral high ground. And indeed, that's where I think the loss of face for the US is potentially a bit riskier if this gets uncovered. The nice thing, though, is these are covert and ideally clandestine engagements, and the waters are muddy and murky, and sort of a direct line back to the US is harder to prove than you might think. That said, I think the other risk is the long-term negative externalities. What happens from training and equipping these irregular forces, not tomorrow, but 10, 20, 30 years from now? And unfortunately, I would argue that Operation Cyclone, while hugely impactful in terms of imposing cost on the Soviet Union, also set the groundwork for the Afghan Taliban and Al-Qaeda. And we all know how that story turned out for the US government. So those types of externalities are real. I think I would advise before any senior leaders engage in unconventional warfare that serious thought be given to both the short-term potential risk and the long-term negative externalities, and sort of careful assessment, wargaming, red teaming, et cetera, should be undertaken. I'm not arguing that you'd go do this blindly. I think that's certainly a recipe for disaster.
Okay, thanks. That's so we've identified kind of the construct of the national security strategy and net assessment and how we evaluate this. Talked a little bit about the unconventional warfare piece. And then what I'd like for us to do is wrap up with the last topic here and provide us with kind of your overview of your components for the U.S. in devising a UW operating concept for strategic competition. And then if we've got some time, what are some of the identified limitations for implementation? And I'll put that question down in the box as well.
Perfect. And I think the biggest barrier to even getting started here, so you said what is required to devise a UW operating concept. And I think what you meant by this is sort of what are the key components, as you said. But I think the biggest barrier that even comes before that is we need to recognize sort of the nature of the competition we are currently in. And I'm not sure we do. I still think sort of the US government is thinking at this in terms of this war-peace duality or binary, despite the fact that Russia and China clearly view sort of the state of affairs as this continuum of competition with the US. And indeed, even the phrasing that gets used, so great power competition or near peer competitors, and this is phrasing that I've used in this talk here today, I think is problematic. Because if we're seeing this as if we're viewing them as competitors instead of adversaries, we're going to be far more risk adverse in our thinking about what we should be doing here. And it's very, very hard to view China purely as an adversary, given the nature of sort of economic relations that the US has with China, right? No China, no Walmart, no American middle class. And that's, of course, overly reductionist, but we're far closer tied into China than we were with the Soviet Union at the onset of the Cold War, if you will. And so I think we can't even begin to really start thinking about an operating concept for UW in great power competition until we get honest with ourselves about sort of the nature of the current strategic competition that the US government finds itself in. Once that's done, I think there needs to be a redefinition of UW that I've already sort of hammered home, I hope. And on top of that, we've talked about operations in the information environment. I think that's going to be critical here. And I've talked to folks at US Cybercom and elsewhere. I'm not worried that the sort of technical understanding is absent here. I'm worried that the human understanding is absent here. And again, sort of the way in which the Chinese look at these issues and the Russians is quite different from the US. So cyber warfare, cyber sort of competition is a unique warfighting domain for the US. We've sort of made that point with the sort of elevation of US Cyber Command. But China and Russia see cyber merely as a tool with which through to exert influence. And I think they've invested far more heavily in sort of trying to figure out how to understand what extant cleavages exist in society and how do I use those to my advantage to undermine sort of cohesion within an adversary state. And I think that's where sort of the US government is lacking. And perhaps one key sort of feature of an operating concept here might be figuring out how to better integrate whatever happens on the kinetic front in UW in terms of supporting these proxies with a really integrated OIE narrative that better marries extant US military psychological operations and MISA military information support operations capabilities with the technical skills on the cybercom side of the house, with a sort of deep-seated understanding of the local operating environment. And I think sort of the brilliance of the Russian campaign against us is they have a really phenomenal understanding of underlying grievances in the US system. And let me give you a controversial example, but that I think hammers this home. Election meddling in 2016 in the US presidential elections. The best unclassified evidence that I've seen here is from a guy named Thomas Rid, who's a professor at Johns Hopkins University, wrote an amazing book called Active Measures. And Rid's assessment is that, yes, there's very clear evidence that Russia did meddle in the 2016 presidential elections. The evidence, however, is far less clear that it was consequential in the sense of delivering a victory for President Trump at the time. That's not the important thing. What Russia identified correctly here was that this was a hugely divisive issue. And what they were able to do was set up a scenario such that we're still discussing this 5 years after 2016, and the American public is still divided around this issue. And it's a level of understanding of sort of the American system and American society that I think we don't have in many other countries that would be critical to sort of operating in this way. In terms of limitations, really, really quickly, I think the biggest limitation here is going to be risk aversion. What I'm discussing here definitely entails real risks. And I've sort of walked you through what some of those risks might be. And I think there's sort of a high degree of risk aversion amongst DoD and the interagency, and especially so when we're talking about competition outside of the scope of a sort of declared shooting war. And unless we can get beyond that, we're going to have problems. I just finished doing a tabletop exercise with the 95th Civil Affairs Brigade, where I was playing Red, and the biggest issue I was able to sort of exploit was sort of both risk aversion, but also the speed at which Red, me, was able to sort of take decisions relative to the speed at which Blue, the US government, was able to take sort of similarly high-risk decisions, right? The chop chain is just too long for these types of high-risk activities on the US side.
Okay, so that kind of completes my questioning for you today, but I just want to give it one last opportunity for the audience out there. If you've got any follow-on questions, and I'll give you just a few seconds to jump in there. But so, Dr. Koven, thank you for the conversation. Regrettably, our time is coming to an end. As you penned in the article and we discussed here, unconventional warfare offers a particular promising approach in strategic competition as the relative cost to U.S. government versus the targets of the unconventional warfare activities is exceptionally low. Your timely article, Competing with Great Powers Through Competitive Strategy in Unconventional Warfare, in my opinion, is a great primer or guide to think about UW. Helping one's knowledge and mindset by outlining the net assessment approach, the potential of it, the risk, and then the benefits of employing unconventional warfare against peer competitors, and a framework to derive an operating concept for today's compound security environment. Dr. Koven, again, thank you so much for sharing your time and your expertise with us today. I'll give you the last word.
My absolute pleasure. This has been a ton of fun, and thank you so much for moderating a really thorough discussion. I greatly appreciate it.
You're welcome. Hey, this goes out to all the audience out there. If you will flip me back over, JB, and for feedback on the session or any Think JSOW activity, please contact the JSOW Strategic Engagement Department at email thinkjsow, one word, thinkjsow, at jsow.us. We'd love to hear from how to improve this. We'd like to also encourage you to send us your possibilities for future speakers. I'd like to close once again, encouraging everyone to explore and complete the Think JSOW collection, the complete JSOW collection. I want you to go complete it. But by visiting and subscribing to JSOW's social media channels at YouTube, Facebook, and LinkedIn. You can always check out our upcoming courses and events at www.jsow.us. Our events up on there. Our next forum is going to be in September, but we will have a number of these summer series lectures from now until then. Thank you all for watching and participating in this webinar, and I wish you all well. Thank you.